Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. The Road to Mecca by Muhammad Asad. To purchase this book, kindly check the links in the description. Start of Chapter 3. Winds. Section 1. We ride, ride, 2 men on 2 dromedaries, and the morning glides past us. It is strange, very strange. Zad's voice breaks through the silence. What is strange, Zad? Is it not strange, O my uncle, that only a few days ago we were going to Taima, and now our camels' heads point toward Mecca? I am sure thou didst not know it thyself before that night. Thou art wayward like a Badawi, like myself. Was it a jinn, O uncle, who gave me that sudden decision 4 years ago to go to thee at Mecca, and gave thee now thy decision to go to Mecca? Are we letting ourselves be thus blown around by the winds because we do not know what we want? No, Zad, thou and I, we allow ourselves to be blown by the winds because we do not know what we want. Our hearts know it, even if our thoughts are sometimes slow to follow. But in the end they do catch up with our hearts, and then we think we have made a decision. Perhaps my heart knew it even on that day 10 years ago, when I stood on the planks of the ship that was bearing me on my first journey to the Near East, southward through the Black Sea, through the opaqueness of a white, rimless, foggy night, through a foggy morning, toward the Bosporus. The sea was leaden. Sometimes foam sprayed over the deck. The pounding of the engines was like the beat of a heart. I stood at the rail, looking out into the pale opaqueness. If you had asked me what I was thinking then, or what expectations I was carrying with me into this first venture to the east, I would hardly have been able to give a clear answer. Curiosity, perhaps. But it was a curiosity which did not take itself very seriously, because it seemed to aim at things of no great importance. The fog of my uneasiness, which seemed to find something related in the welling fog over the sea, was not directed toward foreign lands and the people of coming days. The images of a near future, the strange cities and appearances, the foreign clothes and manners which were to reveal themselves so soon to my eyes hardly occupied my thoughts. I regarded this journey as something accidental and took it, as it were, in my stride, as a pleasing but nevertheless not too important interlude. At that moment, my thoughts were perturbed and distracted by what I took to be a preoccupation with my past. The past? Did I have any? I was 22 years old. But my generation, the generation of those who had been born at the turn of the century, had lived perhaps more quickly than any other before it, and to me it seemed as if I were looking back into a long expanse of time. All the difficulties and adventures of those years stood before my eyes, all those longings and attempts and disappointments, and the women, and my first assaults on life. Those endless nights under stars when one did not quite know what one wanted and walked with a friend through the empty streets, speaking of ultimate things, quite forgetting how empty the pockets were and how insecure the coming day. A happy content which only youth can feel, and the desire to change the world and to build it anew. How should community be shaped so that men could live rightly and in fullness? How should their relationships be arranged so that they might break through the loneliness which surrounded every man, and truly live in communion? What is good, and what evil? What is destiny? Or to put it differently, what should one do to become really, and not merely in pretensions, identical with one's own life so that one could say, I and my destiny are one? Discussions which never came to an end. The literary cafes of Vienna and Berlin, with their interminable arguments about form, style, and expression, about the meaning of political freedom, about the meeting of man and woman, hunger for understanding, and sometimes for food as well, and the nights spent in passions without restraint, a dishevelled bed at dawn when the excitement of the night was ebbing, and slowly became grey and rigid and desolate. But when the morning came, one had forgotten the ashes of the dawn, and walked again with swinging steps and felt the earth tremble joyfully under one's feet. The excitement of a new book or a new face, searching and finding half replies, and those very rare moments when the world seemed suddenly for seconds to stand still, illumined by the flash of an understanding that promised to reveal something that had never been touched before, an answer to all the questions. They had been strange years, those early 20s in Central Europe. The general atmosphere of social and moral insecurity had given rise to a desperate hopefulness, which expressed itself in daring experiments in music, painting, and the theatre, as well as in groping, often revolutionary inquiries into the morphology of culture. But hand in hand with this forced optimism went a spiritual emptiness, a vague, cynical relativism born out of increasing hopefulness with regard to the future of man. In spite of my youth, it had not remained hidden from me that after the catastrophe of the Great War, things were no longer right in the broken up, discontented, emotionally tense and high-pitched European world. Its real deity, I saw, was no longer of a spiritual kind. It was comfort. No doubt there were still many individuals who felt and thought in religious terms and made the most desperate efforts to reconcile their moral beliefs with the spirit of their civilization, but they were only exceptions. The average European, whether Democrat or Communist, manual worker or intellectual, seemed to know only one positive faith: the worship of material progress, the belief that there could be no other goal in life than to make that very life continually easier, or, as the current expression went, independent of nature. The temples of that faith were the gigantic factories, cinemas, chemical laboratories, dance halls, hydroelectric works, and its priests were the bankers, engineers, politicians, film stars, statisticians, captains of industry, record airmen, and commissars. Ethical frustration was evident in the all-round lack of agreement about the meaning of good and evil, and in the submission of all social and economic issues to the rule of expediency. That painted lady of the streets, willing to give herself to anybody, at any time, whenever she is invoked. The insatiable craving after power and pleasure had of necessity led to the break-up of Western society into hostile groups armed to the teeth and determined to destroy each other, whenever and wherever their respective interests clashed. And on the cultural side, the outcome was the creation of a human type whose morality appeared to be confined to the question of practical utility alone, and whose highest criteria of right and wrong was material success. I saw how confused and unhappy our life had become, how little there was of real communion between man and man, despite all the strident, almost hysterical, insistence on community and nation. How far we had stayed from our instincts, and how narrow, how musty our souls had become. I saw all this, but somehow it never seriously occurred to me, as it never seems to have occurred to any of the people around me, that an answer, or at least partial answers to these perplexities might perhaps be gained from other than Europe's own cultural experiences. Europe was the beginning and the end of all our thinking, and even my discovery of Lao Tse, at the age of 17 or so, had not altered my outlook in this respect. It was a real discovery. I had never before heard of Lao Tse and had not the slightest inkling of his philosophy, when one day I chanced upon a German translation of the Tao Te King, lying on the counter of a Vienna bookshop. The strange name and title made me mildly curious. Opening the book at random, I glanced at one of its short aphoristic sections, and felt a sudden thrill, like a stab of happiness, which made me forget my surroundings and kept me rooted where I stood spellbound, with the book in my hands. For in it I saw human life in all its serenity, free of all cleavages and conflicts, rising up in that quiet gladness which is always open to the human heart whenever it cares to avail itself of its own freedom. This was truth, I knew it, a truth that had always been true, although we had forgotten it, and now I recognized it with the joy with which one returns to one's long lost home. From that time onward, for several years, Lao Tse was to me a window through which I could look out into the glass-clear regions of a life that was far away from all narrowness and all self-created fears, free of the childish obsession which was forcing us from moment to moment, always to secure our existence anew by means of material improvement at any price. Not that material improvement seemed to be wrong or even unnecessary to me. On the contrary, I continued to regard it as good and necessary. But at the same time, I was convinced that it could never achieve its end, to increase the sum total of human happiness, unless it were accompanied by a reorientation of our spiritual attitude and a new faith in absolute values. But how such a reorientation could be brought about, and of what kind the new valuations were to be, was not quite clear to me. It would certainly have been idle to expect that men would change their aims, and thus the direction of their endeavors, as soon as someone started preaching to them, as Lao Tse did, that one should open oneself up to life instead of trying to grab it to himself, and thus to do violence to it. Preaching alone, intellectual realization alone, could obviously not produce a change in the spiritual attitude of European society. A new faith of the heart was needed, a burning surrender to values which tolerated no ifs and buts. But whence to gain such a faith? It somehow did not enter my mind that Lao Tse's mighty challenge was aimed not merely at a passing, and therefore changing intellectual attitude, but at some of the most fundamental concepts out of which that attitude springs. Had I known this, I would have been forced to conclude that Europe could not possibly attain to that weightless serenity of soul of which Lao Tse spoke, unless it summoned the courage to question its own spiritual and ethical roots. I was, of course, too young to arrive consciously at such a conclusion, too young to grasp the challenge of the Chinese sage in all its implications and its entire grandeur. True, his message shook me to my innermost. It revealed to me the vista of a life in which man could become one with his destiny, and so with himself. But as I did not clearly see how such a philosophy could transcend mere contemplation and be translated into reality in the context of the European way of life, I gradually began to doubt whether it was realizable at all. I had not yet reached the point where I would even ask myself whether the European way of life was in its fundamentals the only possible way. In other words, like all the other people around me, I was entirely wrapped up in Europe's egocentric cultural outlook. And so, although his voice was never quite silenced, Lao Tse receded, step by step, into the background of contemplative fantasies, and in time ceased to be more than the bearer of lovely poetry. One continued to read him off and on and felt each time the stab of a happy vision, but each time one put the book away with a wistful regret that this was only a dream call to some ivory tower. and although I felt very much at odds with the discordant, bitter, greedy world of which I was a part, I did not wish to live in an ivory tower. Still, there was no warmth in me for any of the aims and endeavours which at that time flowed through Europe's intellectual atmosphere and filled its literature, art, and politics with a buzz of animated controversies. For however contradictory to one another most of those aims and endeavours may have been, they all had obviously one thing in common: the naive assumption that life could be lifted out of its present confusion and bettered if only its outward, economic or political, conditions were bettered. I strongly felt even then that material progress by itself could not provide a solution, and although I did not quite know where a solution might be found, I was never able to evince within myself that enthusiasm which my contemporaries had for progress. Not that I was unhappy. I had never been an introvert, and just then I was enjoying a more than usual measure of success in my practical affairs. While I was hardly inclined to give much weight to a career as such, work at the United Telegraph, where, owing to my knowledge of languages, I was now sub-editor in charge of the news service for the Scandinavian press, seemed to open many avenues into the broader world. The Café des Westerns and its spiritual successor, the Romanisches Café, meeting places of the most outstanding writers, artists, journalists, actors, producers of the day, represented something like an intellectual home to me. I stood on friendly and sometimes even familiar terms with people who bore famous names, and regarded myself, at least in outlook if not in fame, as one of them. Deep friendships and fleeting loves came my way. Life was exciting, full of promise and colorful in the variety of its impressions. No, I was certainly not happy, only deeply dissatisfied, unsatisfied, not knowing what I was really after, and at the same time convinced with the absurd arrogance of youth that one day I would know it. And so I swung along on the pendulum of my heart's content and discontent in exactly the same way as many other young people were doing in those strange years. For, while none of us was really unhappy, only a very few seemed to be consciously happy. I was not unhappy, but my inability to share the diverse social, economic, and political hopes of those around me, of any group among them, grew in time into a vague sense of not quite belonging to them, accompanied vaguely again by a desire to belong. To whom? To be a part of something. Of what? And then one day, in the spring of 1922, I received a letter from my uncle Dorian. Dorian was my mother's youngest brother. Our relationship had always been rather that of friends than of uncle and nephew. He was a psychiatrist, one of the early pupils of Freud, and at that time headed a mental hospital in Jerusalem. As he was not a Zionist himself and did not particularly sympathize with the aims of Zionism, nor for that matter was attracted to the Arabs, he felt lonely and isolated in a world which had nothing to offer him but work and income. Being unmarried, he thought of his nephew as a likely companion in his solitude. In his letter he referred to those exciting days in Vienna, when he had guided me into the new world of psychoanalysis, and he concluded, "Why don't you come and stay some months with me here? I will pay for your journey coming and going. You will be free to return to Berlin whenever you like, and while you are here, you will be living in a delightful old Arab stone house, which is cool in summer and damned cold in winter. We shall spend our time well together. I have plenty of books here, and when you get tired of observing the quaint scenery around you, you can read as much as you want." I made up my mind with the promptness that has always characterized my major decisions. Next morning, I informed Dr. Dammert at the United Telegraph that important business considerations forced me to go to the Near East, and that I would therefore have to quit the agency within a week. If anyone had told me at that time that my first acquaintance with the world of Islam would go far beyond a holiday experience, and indeed become a turning point in my life, I would have laughed off the idea as utterly preposterous. Not that I was impervious to the allure of countries associated in my mind, as in the minds of most Europeans, with the romantic atmosphere of the Arabian Nights. I did anticipate color, exotic customs, picturesque encounters, but it never occurred to me to anticipate adventures in the realm of the spirit as well, and the new journey did not seem to hold out any special promise of a personal nature. All the ideas and impressions that had previously come my way, I had instinctively related to the Western worldview, hoping to attain to a broader reach of feeling and perception within the only cultural environment known to me. And if you come to think of it, how could I have felt differently? I was only a very, very young European, brought up in the belief that Islam and all it stood for was no more than a romantic bypath of man's history, not even quite respectable from the spiritual and ethical points of view, and therefore not to be mentioned in the same breath, still less to be compared with the only two faiths which the West considers fit to be taken seriously, Christianity and Judaism. It was with this hazy, European bias against things Islamic, though not of course against the romanticized outward appearances of Muslim life, that I set out in the summer of 1922 on my journey. If, in fairness to myself, I cannot say that I was self-absorbed in an individual sense, I was nonetheless, without knowing it, deeply enmeshed in that self-absorbed, culturally egocentric mentality so characteristic of the West at all times. And now I stood on the planks of a ship on my way to the east. A leisurely journey had brought me to Constanza, and thence into this foggy morning. A red sail emerged out of the veils of fog and slipped by close to the ship, and because it had become visible, one knew that the sun was about to break through the fog. A few pale rays, thin as threads, fell on the mist over the sea. Their paleness had something of the hardness of metal. Under their pressure, the milky masses of fog settled slowly and heavily over the water, then bent apart, and finally rose to the right and left of the sun rays in widespread drifting arcs like wings. "Good morning," said a deep, full voice. I turned around and recognized the black cassock of my companion of the previous evening, and the friendly smile on a face which I had grown to like during the few hours of our acquaintance. The Jesuit padre was half Polish and half French, and taught history at a college in Alexandria. He was now returning there from a vacation. We had spent the evening after embarkation in lively talk, although it soon became apparent that we differed widely on many issues. We had nevertheless many points of interest in common, and I was already mature enough to recognize that here was a brilliant, serious, and at the same time humorous mind at work. "Good morning, Father Felix. Look at the sea." Daylight and color had come up with the sun. We stood in the bow of the ship under the morning wind, tempted by the impossibility. I tried to determine for myself the movement of color in the breaking waves. Blue? Green? Gray? It could have been blue, but already a shimmer of amaranth red, reflecting the sun, glided over the concave slope of the wave, while the crest broke up into snowy foam and steel gray, crinkly rags raced over it. What a moment ago had been a wave hill was now a trembling movement. The breaking open of 1,000 minute, independent eddies in whose shaded cavities the amaranth red changed into deep, satiated green. Then the green rose up, changing into oscillating violet, which at first fell back into wine red, but immediately after shot up as turquoise blue, and became the crest of the wave, only to break up again. And again the white foam spread its net domineeringly over the writhing water hills, and on went the unending play. It gave me an almost physical sensation of disquiet never to be able to grasp this play of colors, and its eternally changing rhythm. When I looked at it quite superficially, only from the corner of my eyes as it were, I felt for seconds that it might be possible to catch all this within an integrated image. But deliberate concentration, the habit of connecting one isolated concept with another, led to nothing but a series of broken up, separate pictures. But out of this difficulty, this strangely irritating confusion, an idea came to me with great clarity, or so it seemed to me at the time, and I said, almost involuntarily, whoever could grasp all this with his senses would be able to master destiny. I know what you mean, replied Father Felix. But why should one desire to master destiny, to escape from suffering? Would it not be better to become free of destiny? You are speaking almost like a Buddhist, Father Felix. Do you too regard nirvana as the goal of all being? Oh no, certainly not. We Christians do not aim at the extinction of life and feeling. We desire only to lift life out of the region of the material and sensual into the realm of the spirit. But is this not renunciation? It is no renunciation, my young friend. It is the only way to true life, to peace. The Bosporus opened itself to us, a broad waterway framed on both sides by rocky hills. Here and there one could see pillared, airy palaces, terraced gardens, cypresses rising up in all their dark height, and old janissary castles, heavy masses of stone hanging over the water like the nests of birds of prey. As if from a great distance, I heard the voice of Father Felix continue. You see, the deepest symbol of longing, all people's longing, is the symbol of paradise. You find it in all religions, always in different imageries, but the meaning is always the same, namely the desire to be free from destiny. The people of paradise had no destiny. They acquired it only after they succumbed to the temptation of the flesh, and thus fell into what we call original sin, the stumbling of the spirit over the hindering urges of the body, which are indeed only the animal remnants within man's nature. The essential, the humanly divine part of man is his soul alone. The soul strives towards light, which is spirit, but because of the original sin, its way is hampered by obstacles arising from the material, non-divine composition of the body and its urges. What the Christian teaching aims at is, therefore, man's freeing himself from the non-essential, ephemeral, carnal aspects of his life and returning to his spiritual heritage. The ancient, twin-towered fortress of Rumeli Hisar appeared. One of its granulated walls sloped down almost to the water's edge. On the shore, within the semicircle formed by the fortress walls, lay dreaming a little Turkish cemetery with broken-down tombstones. It may be so, Father Felix, but I feel, and this is the feeling of many people of my generation, I feel that there is something wrong in making a distinction between the essential and the non-essential in the structure of man, and in separating spirit and flesh. In short, I cannot agree with your denying all righteousness to physical urges, to the flesh, to earthbound destiny. My desire goes elsewhere. I dream of a form of life, though I must confess I do not see it clearly as yet, in which the entire man, spirit and flesh, would strive after a deeper and deeper fulfillment of his self, in which the spirit and the senses would not be enemies to one another, and in which man could achieve unity within himself and with the meaning of his destiny, so that on the summit of his days he could say, I am my destiny. That was the Hellenic dream, replied Father Felix. And where did it lead? First to the Orphic and Dionysian mysteries, then to Plato and Plotinus, and so again to the inevitable realization that spirit and flesh are opposed to one another. To make the spirit free from the domination of the flesh. This is the meaning of Christian salvation, the meaning of our belief in the Lord's self-sacrifice on the cross. Here he interrupted himself and turned to me with a twinkle. Oh, I am not always a missionary. Pardon me if I speak to you of my faith, which is not yours. But I have none, I assured him. Yes, said Father Felix. I know the lack of faith, or rather the inability to believe, is the central illness of our time. You, like so many others, are living in an illusion which is thousands of years old. The illusion that intellect alone can give a direction to man's striving. But the intellect cannot reach spiritual knowledge by itself, because it is too much absorbed in the achievement of material goals. It is faith and faith alone that can release us from such an absorption. Faith? I asked. You again bring in this word. There is one thing I can't understand. You say it is impossible to attain through intellect alone to knowledge and to a righteous life. Faith is needed, you say. I agree with you entirely. But how does one achieve faith if one has none? Is there a way to it? I mean a way open to our will? My dear friend, will alone is not enough. The way is only opened by God's grace, but it is always opened to him who prays from the innermost of his heart for enlightenment. To pray, but when one is able to do this, Father Felix, one already has faith. You chose to lead me around in a circle, for if a man prays, he must already be convinced of the existence of him to whom he prays. How did he come to this conviction? Through his intellect? Would not this amount to admitting that faith can be found through the intellect? And apart from that, can grace mean anything to somebody who has never had an experience of this kind? The priest shrugged his shoulders regretfully, it seemed to me. If one has not been able to experience God by himself, one should allow himself to be guided by the experiences of others who have experienced him. A few days later we landed at Alexandria, and the same afternoon I went on to Palestine. The train swept straight as an arrow through the afternoon and the soft, humid delta landscape. Nile canals, shaded by the sails of many barges, crossed our path. Small towns, dust-grey clusters of houses and lighter minarets came and went. Villages consisting of box-shaped mud huts swept past. Harvested cotton fields, sprouting sugar-cane fields, abundantly overgrown palms over a village mosque. Water buffaloes, black, heavy-limbed, now going home without guide from the muddy pools in which they had been wallowing during the day. In the distance, men in long garments. They seemed to float, so light and clear was the air under the high, blue sky of glass. On the banks of the canals, reeds swayed in the wind. Women in black tall cloaks were scooping water into earthenware jars. Wonderful women, slender and long-limbed. In their walk they reminded me of long-stemmed plants that sway tenderly and yet full of strength in the wind. Young girls and matrons had the same floating walk. The dusk grew and flowed like the breath of some great resting living being. As the slim men were walking homeward from the fields, their movements appeared lengthened and at the same time lifted out of the slowly disappearing day. Each step seemed to have an existence of its own, grounded in itself. Between eternity and eternity, always that one step. This appearance of lightness and smoothness was perhaps due to the exhilarating evening light of the Nile Delta. Perhaps also to my own restlessness at seeing so many new things. But whatever the case, I suddenly felt in myself all the weight of Europe, the weight of deliberate purpose in all our actions. I thought to myself, how difficult it is for us to attain to reality. We always try to grab it, but it does not like to be grabbed. Only where it overwhelms man does it surrender itself to him. The step of the Egyptian field laborers, already lost in distance and darkness, continued to swing in my mind like a hymn of all high things. We reached the Suez Canal, made a turn at a right angle, and glided for a while toward the north along the grey-black bank. It was like a drawn-out melody, this long line of the canal at night. The moonlight turned the waterway into something like a real but dream Broadway, a dark band of shining metal. The satiated earth of the Nile Valley had with astonishing rapidity made room for chains of sand dunes which enclosed the canals on both sides, with a paleness and sharpness rarely to be seen in any other night landscape. In the listening silence stood here and there the skeleton of a dredge. Beyond, on the other bank, a camel rider rushed by hardly seen and already swallowed by the night. What a great simple stream, from the Red Sea through the bitter lakes to the Mediterranean Sea, right across a desert, so that the Indian Ocean might beat on the keys of Europe. At Kantara, the train journey was interrupted for a while, and a lazy ferry carried the travelers across the silent water. There was almost an hour before the departure of the Palestinian train. I sat down before the station building. The air was warm and dry. There was the desert to the right and to the left, shimmering grey smudged over, broken through by isolated barking. Perhaps it was a jackal, perhaps dogs. A bedouin, heavily loaded with saddle-bags, made of bright carpet cloth, came from the ferry and walked towards a group in the distance, which only now I recognized as motionless men and crouching camels, ready saddled for the march. It seemed that the new arrival had been expected. He threw his saddle-bags over one of the animals. A few words were exchanged. All the men mounted, and at the same moment the camels rose, first on their hind legs, then on their forelegs. The riders rocked forward and backward. Then they rode away with soft swishing sounds, and for a while you could follow the light-hearted, swaying bodies of the animals and the wide brown and white striped Bedouin cloaks. A railway workman strolled toward me. He wore a blue overall and seemed to be lame. He lit his cigarette from mine, then asked me in broken French, "You are going to Jerusalem?" And when I said yes, he continued, "For the first time?" I nodded. He was about to go on, then turned back and said, "Did you see over there the big caravan from the Sinai Desert?" "No?" "Then come along. Let us visit them. You have time." The soles of our shoes crunched in the sand as we walked through the silent emptiness up a narrow, well-trodden path which led into the dunes. A dog barked in the darkness. As we went on, stumbling over low thorn bushes. Voices reached my ears, confused, muffled as of many people, and the sharp and nevertheless soft smell of many resting animal bodies mingled with the dry desert air. Suddenly, just as you might see in a city, during a foggy night the shimmering of an as yet invisible lamp grow up from behind a street corner, and make only the fog shine. A narrow streak of light appeared from down below, as if from underground, and climbed steeply into the dark air. It was the shine of a fire, coming from a deep gorge between two sand dunes, so thickly covered with thorn bushes that one could not see its bottom. I could now clearly hear men's voices, but the speakers were still invisible. I heard the breathing of camels, and how they rubbed against one another in the narrow space. A big, black human shadow fell over the light, ran up the opposite slope and down again. After a few more steps I could see it all. A great circle of crouching camels with heaps of pack saddles, and bags here and there, and among them the figures of men. The animal smell was sweet and heavy like wine. Sometimes one of the camels moved its body, which was smudged out of its shape by the darkness around it, lifted its neck and drew in the night air with a snorting sound, as if sighing, and thus I heard for the first time the sighing of camels. A sheep bleated softly, a dog growled, and everywhere outside the gorge the night was black and starless. It was already late. I had to get back to the station, but I walked very slowly down the path by which we had come, dazed and strangely shaken, as if by a mysterious experience which had caught hold of a corner of my heart and would not let me go. The train carried me through the Sinai desert. I was exhausted, sleepless from the cold of the desert night and the rocking of the train over rails resting on loose sand. Opposite me sat a bedouin in a voluminous brown abaya. He also was freezing and had wrapped his face in his headcloth. He sat cross-legged on the bench, and on his knees lay a curved sword in a scabbard ornamented with silver. It was nearly morning. You could almost recognize the outlines of the dunes outside, and the cactus bushes. I can still remember how the dawn broke. Grey-black, painting shapes, slowly drawing outlines, and how it gradually lifted the sand dunes out of the darkness and built them into harmonious masses. In the growing half-light, a group of tents appeared and rushed by, and near them, silver-grey like fog curtain in the wind, fishing nets spread vertically between poles for drying, fishing nets in the desert, blowing in the morning wind, dream veils transparent, unreal, between night and day. To the right was the desert, to the left the sea. On the shore a lonely camel rider. Perhaps he had been riding all night. Now he seemed to be asleep, slumped in the saddle, and they both rocked, man and camel, in a common rhythm. Again black Bedouin tents. Already there were women outside with earthenware jars on their heads, ready to go to the well. Out of the half-light that grew into light a diaphanous world was emerging, moved by invisible pulses, a wonder of all that is simple and can never end. The sun struck out over the sand with broader and broader rays, and the greyness of dawn burst into an orange-golden firework. We sped on through the oasis of El Arish, through colonnaded cathedrals of palms, with 1,000 pointed arches of palm fronds, and a brown-green lattice-work of light and shade. I saw a woman with a filled jar on her head, coming from the well and going slowly up a path under the palms. She wore a red and blue dress with a long train, and was like a high lady from a legend. The palm orchards of Alarish disappeared as suddenly as they had come. We were now traveling through shell-colored light. Outside, behind the shaking window panes, a stillness such as I never had thought possible. All forms and movements were devoid of a yesterday and a tomorrow. They were simply there in a heady uniqueness. Delicate sand, built up by the wind into soft hillocks that glowed pale orange under the sun, like very old parchment, only softer, less brittle in their breaks and curves, swinging in sharp, decisive violin strokes on the summits, infinitely tender in the flanks, with translucent watercolor shadows, purple and lilac and rusty pink in the shallow tips and hollows. Opalescent clouds, cactus bushes here and there, and sometimes long-stemmed hard grasses. Once or twice I saw spare, barefooted Bedouins, and a camel caravan loaded with palm fronds, which they were carrying from somewhere to somewhere. I felt enwrapped by the great landscape. Several times we stopped at small stations, usually no more than a few barracks of timber and tin. Brown tattered boys ran around with baskets and offered figs, hard-boiled eggs and fresh, flat loaves of bread for sale. The Bedouin opposite me rose slowly, unwound his headcloth and opened the window. His face was thin, brown, sharply drawn, one of those hawk faces which always look intently ahead. He bought a piece of cake, turned around and was about to sit down, when his eye fell on me, and without a word he broke his cake into two and offered me half. When he saw my hesitation and astonishment, he smiled, and I saw that the tender smile fitted his face as well as the intentness of a moment ago, and said a word which I could not understand then, but now know as the faddal, which means grant me the favor. I took the cake and thanked him with a nod. Another traveller, he wore with the exception of his red fez, European clothes and may have been a small trader, intervened as translator. In halting English he said, "He say, you traveller, he traveller, your way and his way is together." When I now think of this little occurrence, it seems to me that all my later love for the Arab character must have been influenced by it. For in the gesture of this Bedouin, who over all barriers of strangeness sensed a friend in an accidental travelling companion, and broke bread with him, I must already have felt the breath and the step of a humanity free of burden. After a short while came old Gaza, like a castle of mud, living its forgotten life on a sand hill between cactus walls. My Bedouin collected his saddlebags, saluted me with a grave smile and a nod, and left the carriage, sweeping the dust behind him with the long train of his cloak. Two other Bedouins stood outside on the platform and greeted him with a handshake and a kiss on both cheeks. The English-speaking trader put his hand on my arm. "Come along, still quarter our time." Beyond the station building a caravan was encamped. They were, my companion informed me, Bedouins from northern Hijaz. They had brown, dusty, wild, warm faces. Our friend was among them. He appeared to be a person of some account, for they stood in a loose semicircle around him and answered his questions. The trader spoke to them and they turned towards us, friendly, and I thought somewhat superciliously, considering our urban existence. An atmosphere of freedom surrounded them, and I felt a strong desire to understand their lives. The air was dry, vibrating, and seemed to penetrate the body. It loosened all stiffness, disentangled all thoughts and made them lazy and still. There was a quality of timelessness in it, which made all things seen and heard and smelled assume distinct values in their own right. It began to dawn on me that people who come from the environment of the desert must sense life in a way quite different from that of people in all other regions. They must be free from many obsessions, perhaps also from many dreams, peculiar to inhabitants of colder, richer lands, and certainly from many of their limitations. And because they have to rely more intimately on their own perceptions, these desert dwellers must set a quite different scale of values to the things of the world. Perhaps it was a presentiment of coming upheavals in my own life that gripped me on that first day in an Arab country at the sight of the Bedouins. The presentiment of a world which lacks all defining limits but is, nonetheless, never formless, which is fully rounded in itself, and nevertheless open on all sides, a world that was soon to become my own. Not that I was then conscious of what the future held in store for me. Of course not. It was rather as when you enter a strange house for the first time, and an indefinable smell in the hallway gives you dimly a hint of things which will happen in this house, and will happen to you. And if they are to be joyful things, you feel a stab of rapture in your heart, and you will remember it much later, when all those happenings have long since taken place, and you will tell yourself, all this I have sensed long ago, thus and in no other way in that first moment in the hall. End of section 1 of chapter 3.